The other day, I was sitting at a small, steam-filled gukbap restaurant near an industrial complex in Gyeonggi province. For those who haven't experienced it, gukbap is a traditional, a really hearty working-class soup. It's the kind of simple hot meal that fuels intense physical labor. And across from me was this young man, maybe early 20s, still in his dusty navy blue work vest. He was just staring at his phone, watching a K-pop music video, all high energy, and his face was lit up by these neon colors from a world that looked absolutely nothing like the factory floor he'd just left. So I struck up a conversation, and he told me he'd moved here from Southeast Asia, drawn in, like so many people, by that exact Korean wave glamour. He's actually one of the tens of thousands of foreign nationals who've contributed to this record-breaking surge. We're talking over 1.1 million foreign workers in South Korea now. That's a nearly 10% jump in just 1 year. And he talked about his salary, which was right in that 2 to 3 million won range where over half of his peers land. And he had this sort of quiet pride about it. For him, the money was good. The dream of being in the land of his favorite idols. Well, it was technically fulfilled. But then I asked him what the hardest part of his new life was. And, I was expecting him to say the language barrier or the freezing winters, maybe the loneliness of being so far from home. But instead, his whole expression it shifted. It became weary, almost clinical. He didn't mention the work itself. He mentioned the clock. Everything is pali-pali, he said. That's the famous Korean term for hurry, hurry. He described a workplace where the rhythm of the machines felt like this relentless heartbeat he just couldn't quite keep up with. It wasn't the heat of the plant or how complex the tasks were that wore him down. It was the suffocating speed, just the relentless pace of the Korean work culture. And it's this fascinating kind of jarring contradiction, right? We're seeing this unprecedented influx of people, all driven by a global obsession with Korean culture. But once they get there, the biggest obstacle to their Korean dream isn't discrimination. It isn't even low wages. For the 1.1 million people powering the nation's factories and services, the greatest struggle is just trying to breathe in a system that refuses to slow down. And it just raises this deeper question. As Korea opens its doors wider than ever, is its most defining cultural trait, its legendary speed, becoming the very thing that pushes its new workforce to the brink.
Exactly. And to really grasp the scale of that pressure you just described, we first have to understand the sheer volume here. I mean, we're talking over 1 million people, and behind them is this incredibly sophisticated policy machine that governs their lives. What we're really looking at is South Korea's strategic management of this record-high foreign labor force. And it demonstrates a very controlled integration model that's designed to achieve what some academics call an alternative modernity.
Okay, alternative modernity. Let's break that down. What does that mean in simple terms?
It means they want the economic power that comes with mass labor, but they want it without the huge social and cultural shifts that, Western nations experience with their own mass immigration.
So they want the workers, but not necessarily the immigration story that comes with them.
Precisely. Korea wants control, and it wants sustained industrial productivity, but also wants to maintain social order and, the fundamental homogeneity of its society. So they use this very targeted foreign recruitment to do it, which makes the worker an explicitly temporary economic input.
An input, like a component in a machine.
In a way, yes. It resists the idea of them becoming permanent cultural or social inputs. So this whole polity machine is meant to provide stability for the nation's economy. But the human experience, as you found, seems to be defined by this rigorous workplace discipline and that intense feeling of pali-pali.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to get into the Republic of Korea's flagship program for low-skilled temporary labor, the Employment Permit System, or EPS. And what's fascinating is that the system is actually held up globally as a model for ethical labor management. So we need to figure out how this highly controlled, incredibly efficient system coexists with that feeling of relentless speed and high stress that workers on the ground are reporting. And, what this all tells us about the country's unique cultural landscape.
Okay, so before we dive right into the EPS itself, it's really important to understand the basic tension that exists in any national policy about temporary labor. Migration policies in the receiving nations, they're typically guided by 3 main goals. And the thing is, you can usually only do 2 of them really well because they're always sort of pulling against each other. The first one is control. This is, paramount for the receiving country. It's about ensuring security, strictly managing who comes in and who goes out, and cracking down on illegal activities like human trafficking or people overstaying their visas.
Right, the basics, border security, legal status.
Exactly. The second one is co-development. This goal is all about mutual economic gain. So the sending country benefits from remittances, money sent home, and maybe some skills the worker brings back. And the receiving country, of course, gets the essential labor it needs for its struggling sectors.
Okay, so that's the economic win-win.
Supposedly. And then the third one is coexistence. This is the social goal.
Yeah.
It's about promoting the integration of immigrants and their families, ensuring social cohesion, and trying to minimize friction between the new and old communities.
And this is where the Korean system really stands out from, say, models in Europe or North America. Korea's EPS, which they launched back in 2004, is just a perfect example of a government facilitating temporary labor by focusing almost entirely on those first two, on control and co-development. It's all about using targeted foreign recruitment to keep industries productive. And it seems like it deliberately minimizes or maybe even completely sidesteps that third objective of coexistence.
It does, because it views the program as a temporary labor solution, not an immigration pathway. And that intentional focus is, from their perspective, the system's core strength. The EPS is classified as a non-seasonal guest worker program for low-skilled labor. But what makes it a global benchmark is how it operates. It functions as a pure government-to-government arrangement.
G2G.
Yes, G2G. And this is all formalized through bilateral labor agreements or memorandums of understanding with the 16 or so partner countries.
Okay, but why is that G2G structure so critical? I mean, we see systems in the Gulf states or even parts of the U.S. that lean heavily on private recruitment agencies and all sorts of middlemen.
And that's the key difference. The G2G model minimizes that reliance on private recruiters, who traditionally introduce just immense risks into the process. In systems dominated by private brokers, the worker often faces these exorbitant fees, what we call information asymmetry.
Meaning they don't really know what the job is like until they're already there.
Exactly. And there's a much higher risk of outright exploitation, debt bondage, even human trafficking. By putting the entire process under the direct oversight of government agencies, specifically the Korean Labor Ministry, they cut out the profit motive of the middleman. This boosts control, transparency, and crucially, worker safety.
And the institutional setup is also very strategic, isn't it? The whole thing is led by the Labor Ministry, which manages this specific E-9 temporary worker visa. And they keep it strictly separate from the broader immigration and social issues, which that falls under the Ministry of Justice.
That separation is absolutely critical to that idea of alternative modernity we talked about. It helps the Korean government manage the sensitive political economy and public opinion around the foreign workforce. By defining it as a labor market tool, a purely economic input, rather than a social or cultural shift, the government can keep tighter political control and reduce friction at home.
They're essentially saying this is not about changing our society. This is just about filling essential job vacancies.
That's the message. And this whole strategic separation, it came about directly from learning from failure.
Yeah.
The EPS wasn't Korea's first crack at this. It replaced the really troubled industrial trainee system, or IIS, back in 2004.
Then that system was a mess.
A complete failure by almost every metric. It was designed under the guise of technology transfer, so foreign workers would enter as trainees. But because it wasn't a formal employment relationship, it just led to widespread worker exploitation. Private recruiters dominated, driving up costs for the workers, fostering abuse. And because the legal status was so murky, when abuses happened, the workers had very little legal recourse.
So the weaknesses of the ITS led to a complete overhaul in 2004. And the new EPS was built around transparency, security, and regulation. It seems like it had three core mandates to fix the failures of the past.
It did. First was transparency. The government published these detailed operational manuals, used public online tools. They prescribed and publicized all the rules, procedures, even the statistics. This was a direct attack on the secrecy that allowed those private brokers to thrive.
Okay, and the second?
Second, ensuring equal rights. Now, this is a revolutionary shift. Foreign workers under the EPS are explicitly subject to the same Korean labor regulations as Korean nationals.
So that means legal protection for minimum wage.
Correct, which during the study period was around $5.70 an hour. And it also mandates overtime pay requirements, which has to be 50% higher than the regular wage.
And the third mandate?
Facilitating return. The system is explicitly temporary. It limits the maximum continuous stay to 4 years and 10 months, with very minimal renewal conditions. This is a crucial control objective aimed at minimizing overstays, which was the biggest problem with the old ITS.
So let's turn to the hard numbers that really show how successful this policy shift was, especially on migration costs. Because this seems to be the single most celebrated achievement of the G2G model around the world.
The evidence here is just. It's overwhelming. One of the greatest moral and economic failures of these kinds of labor schemes globally is that initial financial exploitation by middlemen. It forces workers into debt bondage before they even start working.
Right.
Under the old industrial trainee system, the total cost that workers from most participating countries paid before they earned a single cent was about US $3,700.
$3,700
Yes.
just to get the job.
Yes. And that often covered exorbitant recruitment fees, training fees, transportation, all of it marked up by private brokers.
So what happened under the G2G EPS model?
The cost was slashed. By nearly 3/4 for most workers, it went down to less than US $1,000.
Wow. That is a monumental achievement in, international labor ethics and management.
It truly is.
Yeah.
This cost reduction makes Korea one of the lowest cost destinations in the world for migrants seeking temporary work. Just think about that difference. Almost $2,700 for a young person leaving a developing economy. I mean, in a country like Nepal or Vietnam, that can be a crippling generational debt.
That financial relief is completely transformative, and we can see the impact right away. To put it in perspective, the upfront cost relative to a migrant's first month of earnings, it dropped from around 7 months of earnings under the old system to only about 1 month under the EPS. A worker used to spend their first 7 months just paying off the debt to get the job. Now they can start sending money home almost immediately.
And this transparency, this low cost, it had a direct and profound impact on that primary objective we talked about: control. By removing the need for migrants to take out these massive loans at high interest rates just to get to Korea, you remove the overwhelming incentive to stay in the country illegally just to pay off that debt.
It takes away the economic necessity of becoming an illegal overstay.
It does. And what was the result on compliance?
What did the numbers show?
The results were stark. The share of workers who overstay their visas just plummeted. It dropped from about 50% under the ITS
Half of them.
to less than 10% under the EPS by 2014. The policy achieved exactly what it set out to do: maximize the economic benefit and minimize unregulated human movement.
So on paper, the EPS is a staggering success story for international labor management. It's precise, it's highly controlled, it's designed to maximize economic gain for both sides, while exercising tight state control and minimizing that pre-arrival exploitation. But, blueprints often hide the reality on the ground. When we move from the labor ministry's successful spreadsheets to that Gyeonggi factory floor, the story changes dramatically. We need to look at where the human element, that pali-pali pressure, starts to fray the edges of this meticulously managed machine.
All right, let's turn to the hard numbers that profile the actual labor force powering this system. This data is from 2011 to 2015, and this is the demographic that is absorbing all that pali-pali pressure. Demographically, it's an overwhelmingly young male group. The average age is just 26.
26.
Yeah. About 2/3 of the EPS workers are concentrated between 20 and 29 years old, which, fits the physically demanding nature of the jobs they're filling. The female share is tiny less than 10% overall, though some countries like Cambodia and Thailand show slightly higher percentages, which often reflects roles in, say, light manufacturing or some service industries.
And geographically, where are they? Where are they concentrated?
Over 1/3 of all EPS workers are located in Gyeonggi-do, which is exactly where you were. It's a massive area for small and medium manufacturing companies. The origin diversity is also pretty robust. 4 countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, they make up over 55% of the workforce, which shows the wide reach of these bilateral agreements. We're also seeing big increases from Nepal and Cambodia, partly due to rising demand in the less popular but essential agriculture sector.
And they're concentrated in specific sectors for a reason. EPS workers are, overwhelmingly funneled into manufacturing, right? Over 80% of them. They're specifically recruited to fill vacancies in the so-called 3D occupations.
And we really need to unpack what 3D means in the Korean context.
Yeah.
It's dirty, difficult, and dangerous. And these aren't just generic hard jobs. We are talking about intense foundry work, remote fishery processing, deep-sea fishing, metalworking, dangerous welding environments.
These are the jobs that domestic Korean workers increasingly refuse to do.
Exactly. Often because the pay is low relative to the intensity of the work and because of that demanding pace.
And this demand for just pure physical effort is reflected in what employers are looking for. I saw that less than 14% of employers expressed a preference for good Korean language skills.
Correct. The work is often menial. It relies more on physical endurance and soft skills like diligence. rather than high intellectual or communicative capacity. And that has real implications for a worker's long-term integration and skill development. It basically locks them into the lowest rung of the labor ladder for their whole time in the country. They're defined by their physical ability to keep up with the speed, not their ability to assimilate linguistically or professionally.
So even with this high level of government intervention and this sophisticated multi-phase G2G process, I mean, it includes language tests, applications, job matching, training, the system still faces a really critical flaw: matching inefficiency.
This is a major structural problem. The system uses a meticulous process, with applicant screening by the Human Resources Development Service of Korea, a centralized national employment system. And yet, fewer successful worker-employer matches happen than the assigned quota. Look at this statistic. Only about 50% of posted vacancies are ever successfully filled.
Wait, 50%? That's a staggering failure rate for a system that's designed for maximum efficiency and control. Why? Why is the failure rate in matching so high?
Because the matching process is fundamentally employer-focused. The firms, they communicate broad preferences, often nationality, age, or gender, and the job centers just give them a short list of 3 candidates. The firms hold all the power. The workers, meanwhile, have extremely limited information. They're making these life-altering decisions based on really imperfect data.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. A worker might prioritize a sector like agriculture because the language test cutoffs are lower, which signals an easier way in. But they have no way of knowing the true difficulty or vulnerability of that specific worksite until they actually arrive. This information asymmetry leads directly to high post-arrival friction because their expectations just do not match the reality of the work environment.
And that friction shows up as staggering job instability, which is the most direct evidence of that pali-pali struggle we're talking about. This controlled system, which is designed for stability, is generating massive internal chaos.
The numbers are just undeniable. Overall, over 60% of workers change jobs after they get to Korea.
Over 60%. So that's not a minority finding, it's the majority experience. The default experience for a foreign temporary worker is instability.
And on top of that, about half of those who change jobs do so within 1 year. The average worker applies for 1.5 new jobs after their first position. Just imagine the psychological stress of constantly being forced back onto the job market inside this highly regulated temporary system where your visa is tied to your employer.
And when we look at the reasons they're quitting, it paints a picture of systemic instability, not just, individual choice. While a big chunk, about a third, do move up a wage quintile looking for better pay, the other reasons point to these fundamental structural problems with the companies themselves.
Let's focus on the volatility here. 22% of job changes are due to employer bankruptcy.
22%? That is astonishing.
It is. I mean, to put that in perspective, in stable economies, job loss due to a company collapsing is often in the single digits for a large population. A 22% rate suggests the system is heavily exposed to non-viable firms. And an additional 13% are due to late payment of wages, which is another clear sign of struggling small businesses.
So what does this all mean for the worker on the ground?
It means the job security that's supposedly promised by the highly regulated EPS is profoundly fragile. It's driven by the vulnerabilities of the small firms they work for. We know that nearly 45% of EPS firms have less than 5 employees. They're SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and they're struggling desperately to stay afloat in Korea's intensely competitive, fast-paced economy.
So the foreign worker isn't just dealing with hard work, they're basically absorbing the risk of corporate failure.
Exactly. They're being pushed back onto this unstable job market, that relentless cycle of pali-pali, because the firm they were assigned to couldn't survive the Korean economic pace. They arrive debt-free, which is a major advantage, but they quickly inherit the economic volatility of the company they join.
And this connects directly back to the story I opened with. A worker arrives, gets placed in a small, struggling firm in a 3D sector, and is immediately subjected to intense speed and pressure. And when that firm inevitably fails, a risk the worker has no way of assessing beforehand, they have to scramble to find a new job within the system. And that just fuels that constant sense of urgency and precarity. The system successfully controls who enters and who leaves the country, but it struggles profoundly to control the quality and stability of the employment experience inside the country.
That paradox is absolutely clear. The system excels at border control, but struggles deeply with internal labor control. So now we have to ask why. Why are the impressive worker protection mechanisms, which are supposed to stabilize this situation, failing to prevent this high turnover and stress?
Right, because we've already established that the EPS has these comprehensive protection measures. They're widely regarded globally as good practices.
That's right. First, you have the legal equality provision. It ensures migrant workers are subject to Korean domestic labor laws, covering minimum wage and mandated overtime. Second, the insurance structure is very robust. Workers get access to the national social insurance schemes, health, occupational accident insurance, just like Korean nationals. And crucially, they also get access to 2 specialized migrant insurance schemes designed specifically to support their temporary status.
Tell us more about those 2 specialized insurances. What are they for?
Well, they're strategically designed for that goal of control. The first is the repatriation cost insurance. This is only paid out upon their legal return home, so it serves as this powerful financial incentive for workers to comply with the temporary mandate and leave legally when their visa is up.
Okay, so it encourages them to go home.
Exactly. The second is delayed payment insurance. This is designed specifically to protect workers against wage default when a small firm fails. Given that 13% of job changes are due to late wages and 22% due to bankruptcy, this protection is absolutely essential.
Although it sounds like it's a protection that kicks in after the fact rather than preventing the job loss itself.
That's a very good point. And despite these layers of protection, the system breaks down significantly in key areas, especially where the work environment is most demanding. Let's focus on the agricultural exception, because that's a growing segment of the labor force.
So what happens there?
Enforcement of minimum wage and overtime is just notoriously challenging in the agriculture, livestock, and fisheries sectors. The work sites are often remote, the hours are seasonal and unpredictable, and formal oversight is thin compared to a central manufacturing plant.
And this weakness isn't just about, remote enforcement. It's actually built into the law itself, isn't it?
Precisely. These sectors are often exempt from certain key labor regulations under the Labor Standards Act.
What kind of exemptions are we talking about?
We're talking about exemptions concerning maximum working hours, paid weekly rest days, and daily breaks. Now, this exemption applies equally to domestic and foreign workers, but it disproportionately affects the EPS workers who make up the predominant workforce in these physically grueling environments.
Right. And then there's the isolation.
Yes. Remote work sites in agriculture and fisheries lead to geographical isolation, and that weakens the workers' access to crucial support systems, like the counseling centers run by the government's HRD agency or regional job centers, which are designed to mediate disputes or help them find a better match. Isolation severely compromises their ability to actually use the legal equality that's promised on paper.
So it sounds like the promise of protection is highly dependent on your geography and your sector. And this vulnerability, it brings us back to the central logic of the EPS, which seems to dictate policy outcomes more than worker welfare does.
That is absolutely the core conflict. The EPS operates under this guiding principle that its main objective is to support firms in select sectors in resolving labor shortages. This means the system inherently prioritizes the employer's needs and the economic stability of Korean SMEs above the stability of the temporary worker.
And this firm-centric mandate has deep consequences for the whole national economy.
It does. The system actively resists implementing measures that might reduce firms' competitiveness, even if those measures would increase worker stability or long-term national productivity.
We saw this play out with the attempt to implement a levy on foreign labor. Can you explain why that levy was considered and then why it failed?
Sure. A foreign labor levy is a common tool used by developed economies like Singapore and Taiwan. The purpose is twofold. First, it raises revenue to support social services impacted by migration. Second, and more importantly, it makes foreign labor slightly more expensive. And by increasing the cost, the government incentivizes firms to either invest in automation, which drives innovation, or to improve their efficiency. It forces them to move away from just relying on cheap physical labor as their competitive edge.
But Korea's attempt to impose that levy back in 2009 failed.
It failed because of intense opposition from the business community, primarily the associations representing those SMEs. They successfully argued that the existing labor regulations and the required social insurance already function like a de facto levy by increasing the price of foreign labor. And the government conceded.
And what's the consequence of that failure?
The consequence is that the EPS risks sustaining non-viable or economically inefficient firms by providing them with cheap, compliant labor. Instead of forcing these businesses to innovate, to invest in R&D, or to automate, the state is effectively subsidizing their outdated business models with this readily available foreign labor.
That 22% job change rate due to employer bankruptcy is the direct cost of that policy choice.
Yes, and the migrant worker is the one absorbing the risk of that firm's inevitable collapse. It is a systemic stressor that is built right into the economic model.
And we see the exact same tension in skill development, or I guess the lack of it. Workers are locked into these low-skill roles even though they have mandatory pre-departure training and a post-arrival orientation.
They're locked in because of that same pali-pali pressure. While the government is mandated to provide skills development, the firms often cannot afford to release their EPS workers for post-entry training, even if the training is free, because they literally cannot spare the time. The demand for immediate production is just too high.
Yeah, if a firm has 4 foreign workers and is struggling to meet a deadline, pulling one worker out for a day of skill training is simply impossible under that kind of intense speed.
Exactly. The firm chooses immediate labor over long-term investment in worker skills. And the workers themselves, who are often using their only day off, Sunday, for essential rest and social activities, they're also reluctant to attend training sessions. All of this just further locks them into the specific, often menial 3D roles they were hired for. It's a self-reinforcing cycle of efficiency that prioritizes immediate production and sustains non-viability, which leads right back to that paradox of high policy control and high internal stress.
Okay, so this high-pressure, fragile labor system isn't operating in a vacuum. We have to place this stressed labor dynamic inside the larger cultural context of the receiving society. We need to look at our second data set now, which reveals this really unique dynamic of institutional trust in South Korea. And this sociological lens might explain why the operational stress of pali-pali feels so incredibly suffocating for the worker.
Absolutely. When you classify societies using the Fukuyama theory of high versus low trust, high trust societies typically have strong ties outside the immediate family and high confidence in their formal institutions, the government, the police, the courts. South Korea, in this analysis, is characterized as a lower trust society.
Lower trust.
Yes. When institutional trust was measured across 6 major national institutions, political leaders, media, the legal system, banks, religious groups, South Korea's overall trust profile was only 49%.
49%. That figure is profoundly telling, especially when you compare it to its regional neighbors.
It's a critical differentiator. Thailand, for example, registered an overall trust level of 84%. And Japan, another highly developed East Asian nation, was at 65%. The fact that Korea's figure is hovering just below half suggests that the operational environment for the EPS worker is built on this very shaky foundation of public confidence. It fundamentally contrasts with the policy goal of maintaining national cohesion and high-trust society norms that you see suggested in the EPS policy literature.
So let's break down where that distrust is focused, because some institutions matter a lot more than others when you are a vulnerable temporary worker.
Right. The lowest trust levels were directed toward political leaders. Only 25% reported higher trust, and religious organizations at 45%. But the third area of significant distrust is incredibly critical to the migrant workers' experience: the legal system. Only 43% of respondents reported high trust in the judicial and legal system.
43%. The psychological impact of that number for an EPS worker must be enormous.
It's the missing safety net. As we just discussed, the EPS relies entirely on domestic labor laws and dispute resolution mechanisms to protect the migrant workforce from wage default, from abuse, from exploitation. If the foundational legal framework is actively distrusted by over half the local population, a migrant worker experiencing late wages or their employer going bankrupt is likely to feel extremely vulnerable and unwilling to use those formal channels for help.
Just imagine you're a young worker from the Philippines. You're already isolated geographically and linguistically. If less than half the locals trust the court system, what is the likelihood that you, as a temporary foreign national, are going to risk using that system to challenge wage theft or abuse, knowing that the whole process could cost you your job and your visa?
The low trust effectively nullifies the legal equality that's promised on paper. They revert to informal mechanisms, or they just endure the abuse, because the perceived risk of engaging the formal legal structure is just too high. This forces them to bear the entire burden of the system's volatility, that pali-pali economic pressure on their own, without the structural protection they were guaranteed.
And we can connect this institutional fragility directly back to that demographic we talked about earlier, that 26-year-old male majority. The predictors of lower institutional trust across multiple institutions consistently included being male, being young, under 44, and being unsatisfied with their health or their standard of living.
It's a perfect demographic overlay. The EPS worker profile is young, male, in physically demanding 3D jobs that are very likely to lead to health dissatisfaction and precarity in their standard of living because of the instability of the small firms they work for.
Right.
The sociological theory here suggests that for disadvantaged populations, distrust isn't arbitrary or irrational. It's a calculated, critical response to actual experiences of inconsistent or even destructive governance. The high turnover rate, the high incidence of bankruptcy-driven job loss, the stress of the 3D jobs, these are all real-world experiences that validate that low trust.
So the worker I spoke to, the one who mentioned the suffocating speed of pali-pali, he's operating within an environment of intense operational pressure, high turnover, firm instability, and that is amplified by this low institutional trust.
The constant effort needed to keep up with the pace is already physically demanding. But navigating it without the high confidence that the institutions will back you up makes the experience psychologically and physically exhausting. The EPS successfully provided financial access and reduced that initial exploitation by cutting those fees, but it demands an intense level of psychological endurance in return. It forces workers to assume risks the policy architecture was supposed to mitigate. South Korea's unique labor integration strategy, it relies heavily on high-trust social norms and rigorous workplace discipline to maintain national cohesion. But our data suggests that reliance is misplaced when the institutional foundation itself is fractured.
So what we've seen is this profound paradox right at the heart of South Korea's labor strategy. Korea developed the EPS, a government-to-government system that's globally recognized for its tight control over migration and its remarkable success in reducing initial financial exploitation, slashing those fees from $3,700 to under $1,000. This is policy success at the border. But the same efficient system, designed to prioritize the competitiveness of small firms by providing cheap labor, simultaneously creates deep systemic stress and instability for its workers. And we see that evidenced by that majority experience of job change, with over 60% of workers changing jobs after they arrive. This is operational failure on the factory floor.
And the sociological context confirms that this stress isn't just economic, it's cultural and institutional. The high demands of the 3D labor market intersect with a society that is characterized by low institutional trust, particularly in the very legal structures that are meant to protect workers, with only 43% trusting the judicial system. For the 1.1 million individuals powering Korea's industrial core, the greatest threat to their Korean dream isn't a lack of opportunity or low wages. It's a relentless, destabilizing pace and fragility that they have to navigate largely without the safety net of high confidence in the very institutions mandated to support them.
The data confirms that South Korea's strategic management of its foreign labor force maintains economic stability and social order by achieving that alternative modernity. But the reality for its new workers is defined by the unrelenting clock of pali-pali within a low-trust environment, fundamentally trading financial accessibility for high psychological endurance.